one way or the other, right? So whether Harbaugh leaves or stays, you're going to have to plan and make some decisions. Anybody at an institution running a business should know that you just have to. And so the thought process is right now is that, and I think this makes sense for a lot of Michigan fans, is that Sherrone Moore is getting a really hard look as a guy who could step in as a leader of the program. And then at the same time, you're bumping him up at OC, so you might have to find someone to coordinate your offense. And then on defense, Jesse Minter's an NFL guy. And so there's some thoughts, that Minter might leave either to go with Harbaugh if Harbaugh leaves, which has been my general feeling since even before the national championship. And Minter might leave for that job if Harbaugh takes him with, or he might go to a different NFL job. And that doesn't mean that he's leaving for sure. That's just, that's a feeling that a lot of people have. And so Michigan's making plans to maybe promote someone like Steve Klingscale on defense. You could look at Mike Elston. I think Klingscale is the logical next step. He's the co-defensive coordinator, has been for the last couple of years. So a lot of movement or possible movement if Harbaugh leaves. And right now, I'm honestly leaning that way, especially with McCarthy heading out. I think since JJ left, Harbaugh, it's a real up in the air decision. I don't think he would have told JJ he was going to stay or leave. And then, I just don't think Harbaugh even knows at this point. So he's going to field the offers. I think ultimately there are some really good jobs out there to take, and I think he'll take one of them. And then Michigan's going to have to sort of pick up the pieces, and they don't want to be scrambling when they do so.
I have heard this out of Michigan fans, and it shocked me at first. And then I heard it out of multiple Michigan fans that they actually want Harbaugh to leave, saying that this is hurting recruiting and not necessarily just this particular time. This could be holding us back with some recruits, but this is becoming a yearly cycle. Now they see with this particular team, this mass exodus. And I say that in a good way, not that people are fleeing the program, but, and then this is going to be difficult to supplement because the recruiting hasn't been on the level of some other programs.
Yeah, I think it's a bit ridiculous because obviously you want your championship level coach. I don't think you'd prefer him to leave, but some people, I've heard the same conversations. But those two things can happen separately as well. You can think Harbaugh's future being up in the air the last 3 seasons plus, really. That obviously has an impact on recruiting, and I would think, to a pretty good degree. But at the same time, he's still a great coach. And so Michigan does want to retain him. Ward Manuel has talked about how hard he's working to get a contract to him, which, that specific phrasing is interesting to me. You'd assume there's one on the table. It seems like there's one on the table, but they're still going to have to keep working with Harbaugh through some of his preferences and the little nitty-gritty stuff in those contracts if he does end up deciding to return. But if you look at, when it comes to people leaving and the mass exodus, Michigan's returning a lot on defense. I mean, they're losing almost every starter on offense, but they're returning a lot of defensive players and a lot of depth players. And so, and if you look at defense, that also makes me pause about the Minter comments because, or at least how they feel maybe about the staff behind him and them returning, whether or not Minter leaves. Because you look at Makari Page came back. Rod Moore came back. Obviously, Will Johnson came back. So you have 3 out of your top 5 secondary players. And then you look at Houseman, Niles Houseman at linebacker, and you bring on Jayshon Barnum from Maryland, who's a very good linebacker. And then interior of the defense, those 2 sophomores can't leave, Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham. But you bring back Josiah Stewart, who could have gone in the draft, and then Derek Moore, who's a sophomore as well. So a lot of players returning, who didn't enter the transfer portal, and Michigan is probably going to have to lean on that defense. Donovan Edwards came back at running back. And then you look at some of the depth pieces. Miles Hinton, who we thought would probably start at left or right tackle coming into the season. He did not. He lost out on the job. He's going to come back, so he'll probably be starting at left. And so there are a lot of guys, and this Michigan team is losing a lot of players, but a lot of guys returning, which is a good sign for Michigan fans, at least that the Wolverines are probably going to promote within if Harbaugh were to leave.
Edwards and Barrett, 2 of the more recent decisions going Michigan's way. And I made a list of the departures, who was obviously out of eligibility and then all these early entries. And Michigan is headed toward a historic NFL draft. Georgia broke Ohio State and LSU's record of 14 with 15 a couple years ago. This list of Michigan players, they've got about 22 draft eligible guys.
Yeah, I think it's going to be close. I do think it's going to be close. And it's probably going to be right around that 14 or 15 number. But if you look at, some of the guys I talked about returning, Rod Moore, for one, I think he's draftable. He's going to get drafted. Makari Page at safety hasn't popped off the screen as much as maybe you'd like for a guy who's 6'4", and who runs really well for a safety, but he's a little light, and I think needs to add a little weight. He hasn't. He's just a hair over 200, and maybe the balance there is that's just where he's at, and that's his playing weight. But that's a guy who you look at the mold that he's in. That's someone who an NFL team might want to draft, late round pick, who could develop into a starting safety or even a linebacker if you want to move in the box. That would be a big change. But yeah, so Michigan has plenty of guys that could be drafted. I do think, like I said, I do think it's going to be close. I do think that there are a few guys who just aren't, the likelihood of them getting picked. I look at someone like Cornelius Johnson and I question that. Michael Barrett will probably get taken. But Barrett, he's a 6-year player and he's a smaller linebacker. Where does he go? Maybe late rounds, maybe a special teamer type guy. Khaleke Hudson's a great example of that for me. If you remember Khaleke Hudson at Michigan a few years ago, a similar mold of a player there. And then there are a few other guys, but I do think Michigan has maybe up to 20 guys who would get picked at most. I'm thinking it's going to be right around that 14 or 15 number.
Khaleke Hudson, I believe, went to the Pittsburgh Steelers. I believe I also misidentified Barrett's decision with Edwards. It was somebody else on the defensive side.
I think it was Josiah Stewart.
Josiah Stewart. Yes, that's who it was. So they lose the rush end there.